Well, the roadmap as a draft is as good as far as it goes, I guess. But there's no shortage of reports lining the bookcases of government ministers and shadow ministers all through Australia talking about what's happening in the electricity sector with new technology. And they all come to the same conclusion, which is that renewable energy is not just the cheapest, but also the cleanest way to renew an ageing, increasingly unreliable electricity system. Of course, it has to be firmed up, which is why there's such interest in storage technology like batteries and pumped hydro and the like, and we will have to use, for some time at least, some gas peaking plants as well. So there's nothing strikingly new about this draft discussion paper. But what we need to reaffirm is that a technology roadmap, whether it's draft or final, added to all of the other reports that have come broadly to the same conclusion, doesn't mean anything if you don't have an investment framework, like the National Energy Guarantee was intended to be, something that gives investors confidence to put their money on the table and actually make this roadmap a reality. And we've seen already last year, before the bushfires, before the COVID pandemic, renewable energy investment was down, according to the Reserve Bank, by 50% last year, in large part because of the lack of an energy policy. So I want to be positive, I want to be constructive, it's good as far as it goes, but there's no shortage of reports that essentially come to this same conclusion. The other thing about this roadmap, I'll just quickly say though, Tom, is that there are still some of the hoary old chestnuts that the Coalition continues to insist upon hanging on to. Nuclear power for Australia, monumentally expensive technology, not something we have an industry to support here, so it would take a couple of decades to build. Coal-fired power is not ruled out, so the idea of building new coal-fired power stations with taxpayer support in Queensland is apparently still on the books unless they rule it out. There's some hoary old chestnuts, but maybe there's something to work with if the Prime Minister comes back to a more centrist position instead of having this dictated by the extremists in his party room.
There has been a big focus on gas from the government. You spoke about that as a transition fuel. The big question is, for how long now? It's been spoken about for a lot of years. Do you think the amount of time gas can be that transition fuel is limited, given this is still a fossil fuel, and unless we're talking about cheap sequestration or CCS of some sort, it doesn't exactly mean a very low emissions future if there's a lot of gas?
Well, obviously we've got to take account of two things. We want the cheapest, most reliable energy system, and whether gas can beat batteries and pumped hydro is ultimately a matter for the market. What we're seeing, even with the market operator recently, is they've rebased or recalculated all of their cost estimates for batteries and pumped hydro. Batteries have come down very substantially because of the technology advances we're seeing around the world. Gas, by contrast, has become more expensive over the last few years because of the tripling of gas prices that followed the opening of the export operations, the LNG export operations in Gladstone. So the market is going to determine this to some degree. But obviously also we've got to take account of the greenhouse gas emissions from gas. And you're seeing investors, regulators around the world, including here in Australia, say that investment, economic stimulus to bring us out of the COVID pandemic and the economic recession that's flowing from it needs to take account of these carbon issues. We saw a coalition earlier this week of the major banks here in Australia, the insurers, the super funds, the big investors that ultimately are going to have to bankroll this renewal, all say you shouldn't be investing in old technology. You should be investing in new technology that takes account of the need to get to net zero emissions by the middle of the century.
Well, there might though be less need for that depending on government subsidies. Are you concerned about this leaked report from the COVID-19 Coordination Commission, plenty of representatives from the gas industry on this, that encourages major underwriting of gas projects and also lifting moratoria in eastern states? Does that indicate to you this might be seeking to lock in gas for many years to come in Australia? Does that concern you?
Well, you're right. It is a very gas-heavy commission, and it does seem to focus very, very heavily on gas as an option rather than the range of other technologies, particularly the cleaner technologies and emerging storage technologies. I'm reluctant to place too much emphasis on leaked reports that haven't yet been received by government, but I think there are some real questions for the government to answer about this report if they are intending to follow it. For example, this pipeline idea across the continent that was the subject of a feasibility study delivered to Josh Frydenberg when he was the Energy Minister only a couple of years ago, said that it didn't stack up. There is no cheap gas in the eastern market. If you ask any of the gas companies, the cheap gas that we used to rely upon has largely been depleted in the Bass Strait fields and the Cooper Basin and such like. So I'm not quite sure where they get the cheap gas from. And we still have the problem of so much of our gas going overseas to markets instead of being available at an affordable price for business and households here. So I'm not going to place too much emphasis on a leaked report that hasn't yet been received, but it does seem a little bit singular in its focus on gas rather than a range of other technologies that don't seem to have been considered by this group.
And what about the big focus from the government on carbon capture and storage, including allowing ARENA and the CEFC to make investments here or give out loans? Is that fair enough? Is that a good approach?
Well, I'm not sure that they've actually indicated that they do want the CEFC or ARENA to work in CCS because the legislation excludes that. What we did 10 or 12 years ago is when we were in government, is to build on some CCS, carbon capture and storage funding that John Howard had set up when he was in government. Kevin Rudd expanded that very substantially, a carbon capture and storage fund from government to support these technologies, because we'd heard the advice of the chief scientist most recently here in Australia, but the International Energy Agency and others had said CCS needs to be on the table as part of a suite of options to deal with climate change. That fund was abolished by Tony Abbott. It was abolished in his first budget and hasn't been fulfilled or replaced ever since by this government. So we're unlikely, in the past, we haven't supported the idea that the government would now raid clean energy funding set up for renewable energy, storage, those sorts of things, because they went and abolished funding that John Howard and Kevin Rudd had set up for carbon capture and storage. You know, we think there is some interest apparently in seeing whether this technology can work in gas fields, not for electricity generation. I think that is not going to work economically. It's not going to stack up. But if industry wants to fund that sort of technology, then obviously they've got to show that technically it can stand up to the experts, and there's an expert panel that will consider that. But let's see how that goes. I don't think we would support, though, clean energy finance bodies being raided to fund essentially this fossil fuel technology.